Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. A recent Canadian Federation of Independent Business report estimated that Canadian businesses spent more than $50 billion on compliance costs, of which $18 billion are directly caused by red tape. And from 2020 to 2024, time spent on red tape increased 35%, or 8 business days. But what is red tape exactly, and is it necessary? Here to discuss is the Senior Policy Analyst for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Emily Boston. Emily, thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, Mo.
So explain it to me like I'm 5. What is red tape, and is it different than taxes?
Yeah, it's my favorite ChatGPT prompt, and that's a really interesting comparison. So I'd say the biggest similarity between red tape and taxes is that they both cost residents and businesses a lot of money.
Okay.
But where they differ, so a tax is something that's imposed intentionally as a revenue generation tool from the government so that they can fund their services. So things that we rely on like roads, infrastructure, education, necessary.
Yeah.
Where red tape comes into play, it's unnecessary or overly burdensome paperwork, regulation that causes a lot of headaches, but it doesn't actually provide any value.
Right. It's not meant to be income for the government.
No, it's not. That's something that's costing you directly, but it's not going into the government coffers to pay for services that we need.
Is red tape basically just a pejorative for the word regulation?
So they're distinct terms. Regulation are rules that are supposed to keep our society functioning properly. They're things that keep us safe, have accountability, make sure there's transparency. I can use like a metaphor to describe it a little bit better. So if you think about regulation as more of a traffic law, so we're in our cars, right? We're driving along.
Yeah.
Red tape is what's making sure that the red light is working, that the signs that you're seeing on the road are in place. You want to make sure everyone around you is following the same rules on the road, right? Disaster would strike if not. They're important. Red tape is a traffic jam. That's when we're seeing things backed up with excessive paperwork, overly complicated jargon or language. It could be something, also, I'm not an urban planner here, you're about to see that, but it could be something like an improperly placed roundabout. It could be signage that is confusing or directs people in the wrong way. There's a lot of different things that go into a traffic jam, but that's what red tape is relative to the rules of the road, which is regulation.
So what I'm hearing is that regulation can be good. You're talking about things like health and safety and I guess overall flow of things, but red tape is never good?
Red tape is never good. It's always something that's going to be overly arduous or burdensome for the average person to deal with.
And we get it from 3 levels of government, from the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal government, right?
Yes, we do see regulation or red tape, from all 3 levels of government, but that looks really different for whether you're a consumer or a business owner. So at like the municipal level, for example, a big red tape challenge that small businesses experience would be things like business licensing. Only in the last year, the city of Vancouver, they had almost 600 different types of business licensing. Now, credit where credit's due, they've compounded that down to under 100 now, which is still a huge amount of business licenses to be able to pick and choose from, but how quickly they were able to chop that down demonstrates to you that that wasn't necessary before. So a business license may be something that they're checking those boxes to make sure that businesses are operating safely and properly, but the wide array wasn't necessary. It's just confusing and costs time. So that's a municipal example of red tape.
So what I'm hearing is that red tape often comes with good intentions. The government isn't necessarily trying to slow things down, but the net effect of some of these rules that they bring in effectively do slow businesses down.
Definitely. You mentioned like some different industries or sectors, they might need more regulation to operate safely. And I think one that automatically pops into your head would be healthcare.
Sure. Yeah.
You want somebody operating on you that has a medical license and they know what they're doing and they're following the appropriate rules.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that in 2023, BC physicians spent over 7 million hours on administrative tasks. And of that huge nebulous burden, they said that about 2 million of those hours were unnecessary. And by unnecessary, I mean that they either could have been slashed entirely, on, again, the doctor saying this, or it could have been delegated to somebody else that does not have a medical degree, somebody that could have been taking care of that administrative work. If we looked at that 2 million hours, that translates to about if we cut 10% of that 2 million hours, that translates to 800,000 extra patient visits a year.
Wow.
So that's really where we see for consumers, not just businesses, the breakdown of regulation, yes, is important, but that red tape burden ultimately is more harmful sometimes to the public good than the safe practices it's trying to protect.
Right. And that's not even a purely business example that you just gave with healthcare. And we're in a healthcare crisis. So it seems like we want to try to find efficiencies wherever possible, right?
Yeah, that's actually something the BC College of Family Physicians, they themselves were calling for that during Red Tape Awareness Week. So you see so many different pockets of all three levels of government where individuals, consumers, and businesses are really, banging their head against the wall. They have these huge headaches and frustrations that sometimes can be really small or sometimes are blown into huge things. Another great example at the federal level would be the recent GST tax holiday that the federal government granted.
I thought that was a good thing. I thought we don't have to pay GST on certain things.
And that's definitely, I feel like the first impression that you might take away from that. The reality was that small businesses struggled with that a lot because they had to update their point of sale systems twice, with the first time less than 2 weeks notice. So think about it. You're one person, you're scrambling to update all these different things, no notice. There's a lot of confusion and ambiguity about what counts for this tax break, what doesn't. So that's an example of a really well-intentioned break for small businesses, but in practicality, it actually has significant administrative burdens that it's putting on their plate.
Now, that's a great example because it's a blanket example of red tape that affected a lot of different businesses. But I'm curious, when we talk about different sectors or different industries, it feels like this is really hard to untangle because each sector and each industry will have a completely different set of red tape measures, right? Is that kind of the issue where you can't just pass a law and say no red tape? You have to kind of go through industry by industry to be able to address this.
So I'd say yes and no to that.
Okay.
There are big picture steps that can be taken to properly address red tape. For example, some provinces do a really great job at counting their overall regulatory burden and reporting it so that everybody is aware of just how much regulation exists. And that way it forces the government to have accountability that when they're introducing new regulations, they'll say, we're going to take a pause here. We should sub this old one out. That no longer makes sense. It doesn't make sense, or we can do this a better way. So that's like a bigger idea of how it's like right away you can implement red tape changes. But at smaller levels, you're right. Things do get very nitty gritty and complex. That said, there's definitely a bunch of examples where people have been banging the drum for a long time. One of my favorite examples is alcohol. BC recently signed a memorandum of understanding with Alberta saying that we can ship directly to consumer wine. That does not apply to the rest of our beer and spirits. Everybody should be able to enjoy our wonderful BC beer, spirits, and wine. And so that's an example of an internal trade barrier. That's a provincial barrier from one to another. It's not internal, but that's getting a lot of attention right now. A lot to do with the big issues we're seeing from our southern neighbor and the trade
and us trying to find efficiencies in our own economy. I want to get you on your soapbox. This is your opportunity for a hot take. Which level of government is worse when it comes to red tape? Are we seeing most of it from the federal level? Are we seeing most of it from the provincial level? Or are we seeing most of it from the municipal level?
All right. Well, I'll step onto the soapbox, but I don't have one specific worst perpetrator of red tape for you. All three levels of government. You can't
give me someone to blame that I don't know why we're talking. No, I'm kidding.
What I can tell you is that we did recently ask small businesses, how much of a priority is red tape reduction for you? About 95% on average say this is a huge priority. But we also asked them, what is your confidence level that each level of government is going to respond to these concerns effectively? Mm-hmm. So only 4% thought that the provincial government would be working to reduce red tape barriers for their business.
Okay.
It was a little higher municipally, 12% said that, but we have to remember that's not just Vancouver, that's across the board for BC municipal governments. So there's like varying levels of faith in our levels of government.
It's pretty low though, even 12% is pretty low.
It's incredibly low. And I do think that we've seen this huge shift in focus of putting more political will and priority into making sure that we're reducing these red tape burdens, like you said, making sure we're increasing productivity and breaking down barriers. But that's only been really recent. The Canada Free Trade Agreement was signed in 2017, so that monitors like provincial trade, right? Mm-hmm. We've seen very little movement on that until a month ago.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Well, Emily, I'm sure a lot of business people and businesses really appreciate the work you're doing. Thanks for flagging this for the rest of us, and thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Folks, she's the Senior Policy Analyst for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Emily Boston. Now, after some business, at what point does your freedom of expression end when it comes to human rights? If you're protesting but not harassing anyone, are you allowed to hold up a sign of protest expressing sexism, racism, or other forms of bigotry? Kyla's court will give us the verdict up next.